Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for being here. It's a beautiful, sunny afternoon, and we're so very grateful for that, and we're grateful to have everyone here. So let's get started. First of all, I'd just like to introduce the panel. We have President Dr. Clarence Wyatt. We have Vice President of Academic Affairs and Dean of the Faculty, Dr. Mark Wilhart. We have Vice President for Student Life and Dean of the Students, Laura Hutchinson. Vice President for Finance and Business, Richard Marshall. Vice President for Development and College Relations, John Osterlund. Vice President for Enrollment Management, Kristen English. Special Assistant to the President, Institutional Research and Planning, Christine Johnston. And Associate Vice President and Executive Director of Communications and Marketing, Dwayne Bonifer.
And as we go on, I also want to recognize two other members of this team. Rhonda Wilhart, who is my executive assistant and the secretary of the board, and Lori Ferguson, who is the assistant to the dean. God knows we both need it. That's absolutely true. So.
All right, let's get started.
Well, I'm glad to have everybody here, and this is listed as a question and answer. So we are here to answer to the best of our ability anything that you're curious about regarding the college, what's happening now, anything. Lovey and I both went to the same college. Many of you know, went to Center College in Kentucky, and one of our favorite professors there was a guy named Larry Matheny, and he would routinely start class by saying, "What's on your minds today?" So we'll start that way. Yes, ma'am.
We have a particular interest in international students and study abroad. So what can you tell us about what's going on with that?
Well, there'll be a bunch of us who can do that. I'll get started, and I think about everybody here can talk about that. It is one of the priorities that we brought to the college, and it's not to say that it wasn't happening. There were good programs in study abroad, good efforts to recruit international students when we came. But it is one of our priorities, and some of the things that we have done in terms of the recruitment of international students is to achieve, I think it's fair to say, a little better focus than we had in the past. We had great students from a variety of places. We were one of a handful of institutions that had assisted with Syrian students who were Syrian refugees that had some wonderful young people do that. In fact, one of them just graduated. He was our Lincoln Laureate, which is one of the highest honors that an undergraduate student in Illinois can receive. And knock on wood, he's about to be admitted to the Washington University Medical School. We've had sort of a great pipeline of students from Ghana for quite some time. And but as Willie Sutton, the bank robber, used to say, "Why do you rob banks? Because that's where the money is." Well, we've started focusing a little more on Asia because that's where the students are, particularly in China and in Vietnam. Vietnam is the highest per capita exporter of international students. Tom in here, is Tom on it? Or is he out? He's probably already down at Market Alley. But anyway, Tom has been a specialist in education in China for a long time. He's been a big help. In terms of study abroad, again, we had some great programs going. We had depended primarily on the Associated Colleges of the Midwest, which is our consortium, which was best known for its study abroad programs, and we wanted to certainly take advantage of those as much as we could. But number one, we wanted to start running our own programs for three reasons. Number one, we can control the cost. And whenever we send a student on an ACM program, we ended up writing a big check to the ACM. Number two, we can control the quality. If it's our people doing it, we can control the quality. And number three, if it's our experience, our people doing it, you can integrate that experience back into campus better. So we've been building a variety of those, and other folks can talk about some of those. But one of the things that I'm most proud of regarding that is a passport program, which some of you all have heard about. If you are we started this our first year here. If you're eligible for a United States passport and don't yet have one, the college will assist you with paperwork and pay the fee, because we don't want there's just a mindset that comes with having a passport. So let others jump in.
Sure. From the recruitment perspective, as of today, we are excited to welcome 18 new international students in the class this fall, and that number may grow a little bit over the summer. There are a handful of most students we're still working with from 12 different countries. The number of new incoming international students has gone up and down a little bit in recent years. International student recruitment is something we're very interested in, but as Clarence articulated, there are some challenges. Many of the students are looking for significant funding, and we provide quite generous funding to international students, but we're not able to fully fund many of them, which is what some are looking for. Given that we don't offer ESL or kind of intensive English transition programs, Mark and I were speaking about this earlier, it's important that we make sure that the students we're recruiting have a given level of English proficiency so that they can make a successful academic transition. We've also seen, and you may have read articles about this, but interest in study in the United States among many international populations has waned a little bit. International students are, some of them, less interested in the United States than they were 5 or 10 years ago, and more interested in places like Canada or Australia, which are experiencing booms, especially from countries like China. There's a lot of different reasons for that. So it's something that we're interested in. It's something that we remain committed to. We have a designated counselor in our office who works with international students. I serve as a DSO for the institution, assisting with the advising and the paperwork for incoming international students. And we're excited about where we are for this year. We're going to have a bigger group this year than we did last fall, which is good.
In terms of programs abroad, last year we instituted an Office of Global Engagement, and we hired a director for that program. She's beginning to build lots and lots of study opportunities for our students. We also voted in 2 years ago a series of what we're calling Scots terms. So in January and May, we've got 2-week short terms where we can take short experiences abroad. I just got back on Monday from taking 12 students to Scotland. We had done a course called Literary Scotland where I taught them Scottish literature for half a semester. That's my specialty. And then we ran around Scotland for 2 weeks and looked at the places that were written about, looked at the author sites. It's a way of deepening the academic experience for the students by dipping their toes into the study abroad. Rather than making them commit for a whole semester, both financially and in terms of the time, we allow them an experience that will give them a taste and hopefully allow them to go back. One of the other things that we're working on right now, and Richard and I were just talking about this, is we're exploring 2 programs, one at the University of Aberdeen and one at the Stirling University in Scotland for semester study abroad. So that we've got some of those longer experiences in an English-speaking country where our students who have traveled some to whatever destination, they can go back and they can continue their academic careers at those places. The nature of the beast is that when the ACM programs began to shut down 3-4 years ago, all of the schools in our consortium began to think about how we could best serve our particular student bodies. And we have spent a lot of time strategizing how we can get our students to think more about going abroad. The Passport program is really fundamental of that. Many of our students, when we recruit them, are coming either from small towns or from areas where economic opportunity is not huge. And so they don't think about study abroad. They think about, coming to Monmouth, and that's a big enough change. Part of what the Passport program allows them to do is to imagine something different from the very beginning. By opening that for them, and then we show them the programs we have, and they're going to professors that they trust. And I think it's a good model, and it's a good model for us.
What else?
Can you characterize the change in students from when the class of '69 came as freshmen to what you see now coming as freshmen?
But despite my hair color, I don't quite remember the classes in college. Yeah, why don't you jump in? Not that you remember the classes today.
No, I was around, but I wasn't quite to college just yet. We're seeing students that are more focused on career aspirations. They haven't known a time really consciously when times were easy for them. They've known parents that have been out of work or been laid off because of the economy at a certain point. And so they're coming in fairly pragmatic about what they want to do. They are coming coming in, they are dating later, they will marry later, they run kind of in packs, and we're seeing how technology plays a role in how they form and maintain relationships, which is really fascinating. In 1969, you had conversations, and they are gonna text you in very short bursts with emojis, and you're not quite sure what they're saying sometimes, and that's often some way the best way for us to get them. At the same time, I find them coming in really open, and I can't speak to the class of '69, I can speak to the sort of the culture of 1969, where there's a lot of unrest, and we see some of that. But they are at least a little bit more trusting of us than I think some students might have been in college in 1969, depending on where you went to college. And I grew up in California, so Berkeley was in our back door, so that's what I remember my parents talking most about. But our students, I find, are coming in very respectful. And I think part of it is the population of student athletes. Part of it is students coming from smaller towns. But I would characterize them as really good kids. And we don't face some of the same challenges here that my colleagues at other campuses are facing. Our Greek community is more respectful, and I can sleep at night because they're mostly not up to terrible things, mostly, well, not anything really terrible, frankly. I kind of wish they'd get a little bit more bucky, frankly. I think they have a little bit of time, but they're a little bit more health conscious, I think, and more aware, and still very, very tied to home, however they define that.
I think, no, I was just gonna add that this generation of students is so fun and interesting to me, obviously, because we work with the high school population. We've heard talk for 20 years now about millennials, and it was all about millennials, the me generation. Well, I'm a millennial, so we're getting older now, and the population of students that we're working with that is coming up through high school and into college now is most often coined Generation Z, and they are very uniquely different from millennials in many ways. As Laura articulated, they're more community oriented. So millennials were often called the me generation. It was all about me. Generation Z is very interested in social activism. They're very concerned about each other and their communities, which is interesting. They are completely 100% digital and 99% mobile. This is not a mobile first generation, this is a mobile only generation, which is one of the reasons that we introduced a new application option this year that allowed students to apply to college on their phone. I don't understand why they would do that, but many, many, many of them do, so we wanted to be responsive to that. As Laura indicated, they also have a lot of interesting experiences because they've grown up almost exclusively in a post 9/11 American world. So safety is of significant concern to these students in a way that's really different than I think what we were experiencing 10 years ago, which is one of the reasons that they're a little more cautious. We talk at length about safety in our campus visits and in our conversations with families, and the students are very financially savvy. They're very concerned about their own personal financial security in a way, again, that was quite different than millennials. Millennials wanted to dream big and go work at a startup and everything would sort itself out. And these students often, in our conversations with them, are more worried about making the money work than their parents when it comes to investing in a college education.
There are many demographers who compare them to the silent generation. I'm class of '72, only in a different institution, so I can relate to what you're talking about. But there are many demographers who compare them to the silent generation, the generation that grew up with the Great Depression and World War II. These kids have grown up with 9/11 and the Great Recession. So they share many characteristics of the silent generation.
A colleague in my office has a good way of describing Mama's students. She says Mama's students walk on the sidewalk. And when we talk about their characteristics, and I think that's a good way of describing them. They stay on the sidewalks, and they do in a lot of ways. the extent metaphor. There's a, I'm not a historian, but there's a higher ed historian named Helen Horowitz, wrote a book back in the 80s called Campus Life. And what she did is she grouped undergraduates, a history of undergraduate life from 1780 to 1984, something like that. It's a subtitle. But she groups undergraduates into three sort of groups. One is college men, college women, which is what we think of the traditional college student. Then there were the outsiders, first generation, people who came back from the war, people who had to work their way through college and things like that. And then she talks about the college rebels, which is people that serve college as a means to another end. I would say, broadly speaking, the class of 1969 was sort of considered college men, college women. It was traditional, whatever. I would say students today, in Horowitz's definition, would be more college outsiders, of what Kristen just said. They have focused a little bit less on college life, a little bit more on their personal life, their finances, their career, and so they've adjusted that way. And so I think those would be the broadly speaking, the way I would term them. There's a new book out, which I haven't read yet, but I've read a lot about, called Going to College in the 1960s by the historian John Phelan. And one of the reasons he wrote that book, he's saying, is because to help us understand better who our students are today, and also better appreciate sort of the rich diversity of the students in the 1960s as well. So it's on my summer reading list because I want to try to see if it makes sense out of it compared to today's students as well. But it's supposed to be a pretty good book in terms of helping us understand the present as well.
I think the last thing to amplify what Tony just said is our students are a diverse bunch. We have 30% of our students who are from underrepresented groups now. We have 5% that are international students. So when you walk into a classroom, that classroom is full of people who are coming from widely divergent backgrounds often. And it's a challenge and a joy to teach those classes because you're trying not only to convey the material that you need to convey, but you're trying to get everybody to understand it when their preparation, their family histories, their orientation towards your material is very different often. And that offers some great challenges, but offers also some real opportunities for great learning experiences for all of our students when they come together in those classrooms, right? It's a strength, I think, that has changed in the past 10 years, right? Not since '69, but even, in the past 10. And I think it's a good change.
Well, I'm not senior staff, but I sleep with one. So I observe a lot of osmosis, and one of the most interesting statistics that I think that you all, that may sort of affect you like it did me when I first heard it was, oh my gosh, to speak to what Kristen was saying about security. I have groups of students at the house, a lot, women especially, and they always talk about safety. But these kids grew up in the post-Columbine shootings era. So it's not just 9/11, it's school shootings that they have grown up as part of their gestalt. And so when I ask the young women at the house, what do you love the most? What I say to them is, if you had a younger sister coming, what would you want her to be able to experience that you have, and what would you not want her to have? And the first thing they always say is, I feel so safe here. It's so wonderfully safe here. It's beautiful, it's safe, I know my professors, but safety is always what they say first. Something in our generation we didn't even think of. The war was on the other side of the globe. And so I just think that's an interesting statistic, that it's school shootings that these kids have grown up knowing and seeing on the news, not something remote. So I think that says a lot. Don't you see that with these kids?
Sure, absolutely.
I never thought of that.
Well, it's interesting, back to the question regarding international student recruitment. There's some data to suggest that one of the reasons that international students are maybe more interested in countries like Canada and Australia and less interested in the United States in 2019 is because of gun violence. And I think everyone's mind goes straight to immigration policies, which is also of concern for some students. But there are a lot of students citing, that's what we experience here is just foreign to many of them. So I was surprised when I first saw that research, but it makes sense when you reflect on it. I agree, Lily.
There's probably also a concern for social safety, psychic security, because of the amount of hatred that's being spewed in a lot of different places.
Absolutely, I think that's a great point. When we think about safety and speaking to these students about safety, we're talking about physical safety and campus security, but we're absolutely also talking about, is this a safe space where students are going to feel comfortable emotionally, psychologically, where they're gonna feel supported and safe in a lot of ways, especially students from underrepresented populations, which we have more of now, as Mark indicated, than we have in the
But
past.
yet you want to challenge them intellectually.
Right, yeah. I leave that to my colleagues. That's quite a challenge, I'm sure, balancing that.
I think, and I know Mark would agree, that, well, Clark Kerr said this, and he was the chancellor at Berkeley. He said that the goal, I want to make sure I get this right, the goal is to help make students safe for college, not college safe for students. And so they should be encountering ideas that are new to them and with which they are unfamiliar and uneasy, but that's very different than encountering a demeaning environment or faculty allowing a conversation to spin out of control where it escalates. That's not what we're about, and that's not good pedagogy. But I think we had a fairly successful couple conversations, big conversations here in the spring about who feels comfortable speaking up in class and what to do about that. And you know, we have a lot of work to do to understand the lives of students who've grown up differently than we have, and they get us. They spent their whole life looking at us and understanding how we work, and we haven't had to do the work the way they have. And so it's been a really important, both an intellectual conversation as well as a cultural conversation, as well as a who are we as a Monmouth community.
Yeah.
And so I think that's been helpful. I know somebody, there you go. You've been trying.
Yes, we've read recently about the college moving into an engineering program. And I would be interested in kind of an update on timing, curricula, accreditation, and facilities for such a program.
Sure. So the timeline on all of this is that 2 years ago, a proposal was put forward through the faculty moved it through the usual channels. And the usual channels is to run it through a curriculum committee of the faculty, who then moves it up to the faculty as a whole, and we voted it in. Part of what we did differently this time than we've ever done before is we actually ran it out for some market research to see whether students would be interested in a liberal arts engineering program and to see whether employers would be interested to hire liberal arts engineers. So all of that came back positively. We got it through. Everything was voted through last year. We successfully hired a mechanical engineer in the spring who is coming down to us after having been a full professor at University of Wisconsin-La Crosse and then working in industry for 5 years. So he's coming back to academics because he, as he said, moving into industry was probably a bad idea. So he wants to get back in the classroom, and he's very excited about starting a program here. Beginning any kind of a program on academic, in an academic environment is a difficult thing. Beginning a mechanical engineering or an engineering program is a really difficult thing because there are physical needs, there are curricular needs. It has a very strict accreditation that goes with it. The ABET accreditation is strict. John is raring to go. My favorite story from hiring John was that I got to the conversation where I was going to offer him the job, and it actually had gotten delayed a couple days. So the chair of our physics department had already told him and said, the dean's going to call you, but then things got delayed and we couldn't hook up because he was gone on a conference. And when I finally called him, he said, you know, I keep waking up at 2 o'clock in the morning. I said, you do? He's like, yeah, I'm thinking about how we're going to recruit next year. I said, would you like me to offer you the job first? So I think we have hired the right guy to begin to lead us into the next phase of the program. We've got the curricula in place for the mechanical. The electrical and the chemical are all there. We need to vote that in. We are hiring, starting this fall, for the electrical engineer and for the chemical engineer. The physical space, the labs are already in place because we're going to modify some of the physics labs for that. So they're already there. Our recruitment, I'll let Kristen talk about that, but our recruitment is is very good. The last stage for us, this year, as many of you know, we went through what's called the Higher Learning Commission's accreditation visit. So we have to go through a whole college accreditation where they look at all the parts of us. And while they were here, we were voting in all the things for the 3 new programs that we're bringing on. And so they said, you know, you have to do some more work on those before we will accredit those. So we are in the last stages of submitting what's called a substantive change on the 3 new programs and the Bachelor of Science degree that we're instituting so that the engineering degree and some of our other degrees can be fully accredited. It's a really exciting time. We are making all the progress. We are in all the right stages. I think we have the right people in place, and certainly admissions has done their job in beginning to get us the students who are going to be that right first class for us. So we're on target. Good. Thank you.
I too wake up at 2 in the morning thinking about how we're going to recruit next year. Occasionally. No, we're excited. As of this moment, there are 13 students in the incoming class this fall that have indicated an intention to major in the engineering program that will eventually exist. And if we have to kind of funnel them through some other courses in their first semester, we're prepared to do that. But we're looking forward to kind of having the official blessing from HLC so that we can really start screaming into a megaphone about this. I'm excited about this. This is a real point of differentiation for the college and a real opportunity for us. There are not that many schools that look like Monmouth that are offering this kind of a program, truly rooted in a liberal arts foundation, that I believe have the ability to deliver it in the way that I'm confident that we will. So I'm looking forward to this. We're meeting with Dr. Fasano next week to start talking about the idea of an engineering recruitment event this fall, trying to get some of these students to campus early in the application cycle. But engineering and the other 2 new programs as well, neuroscience and data science, anytime we have the chance to talk about something new, especially in a period where many colleges are not adding academic programs right now. Many colleges are scaling back and trimming academic programs. So I think this is just yet another example to the marketplace of the strong brand that Monmouth College enjoys and demonstration that this is an exciting time for us. We're heading forward.
Let me just add just a little bit of one more circle of context to that. Number one, talking about the engineering, not pre-engineering, but engineering. Chris Fasano, who is a great business professor, has been chomping at the bit to have engineering here for a long, long time, and is now like a kid in a candy store. Refers to this as Renaissance engineering, which I think is a wonderful phrase. And to me, that's the differentiation between what we're going to do here and some larger institution with an engineering degree. One of our dearest friends is an engineer in San Antonio, Texas, and he's very, very bright and wonderful human being.
Texas A&M.
Texas A&M trained engineer. And if you want a bridge built, Harry Jewett will build you a great bridge. But our students are the ones who understand the cultural, political, economic, social implications of building this bridge at this cost, at this time, in this place. That's the real differentiator for us. And Kristen and Mark referred to the other 2 programs that we brought on at the same time, data science and neuroscience. We're part of the Associated Colleges of the Midwest, and the presidents meet twice a year together, and about the last 45 minutes or so of each of those better part of the day meetings is referred to as executive session, which really comes down to I can't believe my people did this. What do are your people as crazy as my people? That's kind of what it comes down to. I was able to really speak with pride about the Monmouth College faculty. Especially so at this most recent meeting, because one of the themes was the difficulty of encouraging faculty to entertain and embrace change. You can take the true meaning of the word conservative, which is wariness of change. There are no more conservative creatures on God's green earth than a college faculty. Our faculty has embraced this. There is a real spirit of innovation and evolution here. They want to keep this experience fresh. They know that that the liberal arts and sciences has always continued to evolve and always changed. And that if society doesn't care what we do, it doesn't matter how good we are or we think we are in doing it. So we have to continue to grow in that way. And I could not be prouder of the Monmouth College faculty in terms of doing that with all three of these programs. And as Mark said, in the fall of 2017, I put out a call to the faculty to come forward with ideas for new academic programs that would be engaging to prospective students and have strong employment and career opportunities. We went from that call in the fall of 17 to having these programs online, students enrolled in these programs in the fall of 19, and in academia, that's warp speed.
That's unheard of.
And let me say real quick, I see one of our trustees in the back nodding her head. This would not have happened without the enthusiastic support of the Board of Trustees. As a senior staff, we took these ideas to the board, offered the rationale, and we had some great conversation around it. But Gail speak for herself, but I'm very grateful to the board for its support in terms as we bring these programs online.
We have to evolve and change to meet the needs of the students today because competition out there is so stiff. And why a Monmouth if we're not doing something special for our students? And I think you exemplify, all of you, that feeling. And I have to tell some of you, if I can, for a nanosecond.
We work for you. You can say whatever you want.
This was different for me, and I don't know about 1969 because I was 1974. But when I meet with some Monmouth College students and just ask them some random questions to find out what their experience is, I generally in the spring will meet with a group of seniors and say, so tell me what you're going to miss about this place, because I know what I would have missed leaving here and venturing out in the big cruel world afterwards. And I would not have answered the way they answered. And it's been the last several years, this is what they say. They say, I'm really going to miss Professor so-and-so. That's never would have been my answer. And their adoration for their professors is unequaled. They know on first name basis. These people care deeply for our students, and that's what keeps them coming back, which is shocking to me because it would have been my friends. That's what I would have said. I'm going to miss these people that I've been with the last 4 years, and we're all scattered to the wind now. But they really sincerely, I'm not kidding, they're feeling for this place and for the professors who have found who they are inside of them and pulled that out from somewhere it's extraordinary. And I don't think I would find that on every campus that I visit. So anyway, for what it's worth.
The girls say the same thing to me, and they say, Professor so-and-so comes to my basketball games.
Yeah.
Or they come to my choir performance, or they come to my theater performance. Can you believe that, they say? And they
true, yeah.
encourage me. They've kept me, they've had late night conversations with me when I've needed to reach out to somebody, and they look at them as more than a teacher. They look at them as a mentor and almost as a friend.
Mm-hmm.
And I think you're absolutely right. They all talk about. But it's like, can you believe they come to my game? They cheer me on. I see them in the bleachers. They're thrilled by that.
Yeah, how important is it on developing relationships with, in the engineering, liberal arts approach, to develop relationships with end users, employers, or people available for interns, that kind of thing, and what's being done along that line?
Well, I won't name names, but we're involved in developing just such a partnership with an area company that is on the leading edge of some exciting technology that has applications not only to engineering. It is sort of in its essence an engineering company, but it is evolving into a really exciting, different technological realm, and we're developing a really good partnership with them across a variety of fronts, curricular, in terms of business opportunity, economic development for the area.
We'll play place 3 interns there yet this summer. Even before we have the engineering students on campus, we've got physics students. We're going to go begin to work with them to begin to build that pipeline and build the assurance that they have in our students, and our students understand what it takes to be working in these industries. So, you know, part of the academic core of an engineering program, particularly a mechanical or chemical, is that you have to see it working in the world. And so we are intent on having our students have opportunities to do that. You know, being West Central Illinois, that is not always easy, but we are finding ways to do that, and we'll continue to do that. You know, in the sciences, they have what are called research experiences for undergraduates, REUs. And many, many students will do those in place of internships. It's effectively, you're placed in a lab somewhere across the country. And we have in mind essentially a model for REUs for our engineering students. They would be internships, but it would function the same way, which is to give them a practical hands-on experience that will match the curriculum that we are developing here to allow them to think their way through their curriculum and then use it in these other places.
When Moby mentioned Columbine, my son-in-law grew up a stone's throw from Columbine. His sister was in Columbine when that took place. His niece, or his cousin, was in Arapahoe High School and was on the floor of the library when the shooter killed the young boy right next door on the floor. My question is, does this school do anything with active shooters?
We got a variety of authorities.
Yeah, we have material that is out to the campus, and we talk about that in Residence Life. When students come in, you usually have a floor meeting. Some of you might or might not have done that. That became pretty standard early on when students come in because of the Jean Cleary Act. I mean, so a lot of the things that we do have roots in very unfortunate and tragic incidents like that. Our campus safety director is very, very aware of how this works and has great relationships with local law enforcement. He himself was a former he was a police officer. He also did, I think, he's longtime military, he's retired military. And so we've had conversations already, even at the senior staff level, to make sure that we, on a regular basis, are having conversations about that. How we do tabletop exercises. So Student Affairs just did a tabletop exercise earlier this semester to try to just gauge where everybody was in terms of preparedness for things like this. And so some of that we have to sort of ramp up to like a full-scale active shooter test. You've got to start, you got to meet people where they are, I would put it that way. And we also have to be prepared to partner with folks around the Warren County area and even our colleagues at Knox on the aftermath of just even doing a drill can be we have to have folks in to help people, kind of process this and power down a little bit. There was I don't recall what state it was in, but there was an incident where law enforcement came in to do an active shooter training in a high school and lined some teachers up and pretended to shoot them. And they were prepared for that. So I think we are wanting to be very, very thoughtful. Some of our students do come from urban areas where gun violence is very common. And part of why they are here is because it is much less common. And so we don't want to traumatize people. So we've had to do a lot of thinking about it rather than just sort of, let's knee-jerk do this full-scale thing and then not really realize what we're getting into. But Andy Davis, who is our director, is very quick. Several of us are alerted anytime there is school violence or gun violence at a college or university. I get a ticker right away from him. So I think we're aware and feel a deep sense of responsibility to help our students with that.
So drills have not taken place here, and I'm saying that my wife was a college professor at a community college in Kansas City for 22 years. In the last few years, she's told me about a lot of the drills that they've done, and whenever we see something on television, if it's some show and stuff, she's always, oh, no, you can't do that anymore. You have to do this, this, and this. And I was just curious what.
Yeah, at this time we haven't done a full-scale active shooter exercise, which means law enforcement is coming to campus, we cancel, roughly at least a half day of classes where everybody participates. We're not really scaled to do that, but that is a plan that we have, and it doesn't surprise me that is your wife's experience. I'm in a doctoral program that's a hybrid with other higher ed and K-12 folks, and smaller colleges like this have not done it in the same way they have had to do in K-12. And so we've had some really rich conversations about how it's all moving forward, and I think it's going to be pretty common in the next probably 3-4 years, if not sooner, for a lot of small liberal arts colleges to be more involved in that. And not as many of us are yet, but if we are at least aware of that as a need, and we've had conversations about when to plan that, when would be a good time. I think it's also going to be a conversation with academic affairs about getting faculty on board with that. It can be easy in a town like this to say, I leave my front door unlocked. More than on one occasion, I've left my keys in the car, and because you just don't think about it. And so we have a lot of folks who we need to help them understand the seriousness of this. That we can't wait till it happens. That we have to get them ready. But it's hard. You can be lulled into some belief that it just can't happen here, and that's what almost everybody says in schools where it happens. So that's a good question. Thank you.
Yes, sir.
The national media is very strong on projecting graduates from colleges and universities as being very liberal in their thinking. And I'm wondering if at Monmouth there's an attempt to at least provide the other side, the conservative views, to help the students make the decisions for themselves rather than spinning it in the direction that so many of today's young folks are just automatically liberal in their thinking, and bearing in mind how this nation was built and the achievements through some other of the disciplines. So I'm interested in your comments.
I'll start off, and I'll respectfully disagree that that college undergraduates in America are overwhelmingly liberal. God's honest truth, I'm not sure what the words liberal and conservative mean anymore. I think increasingly they are meaningless words in terms of describing our attitudes toward public policy. We have these conversations quite often, and on our board of trustees, we have folks who come from all points on the compass in terms of their political beliefs. Where they are all in common, the ideology that everybody shares is that this institution exists to empower the lives of young people. Our students do not come to us as blank slates. They have ideas of their own already. Like our board, our faculty has a variety of different perspectives. It is important, and I think for the most part, our faculty does a very good job. For the most part, I think our faculty is pretty much in the middle, however one might define a spectrum. Our faculty is pretty much in the middle, or frankly, apolitical. They just want to do their jobs and be left alone. But even those who have more pronounced political views are very good about in doing just what you said. Let's talk about difficult issues. Let's talk about them in a way that is intellectually honest and explores them. And I taught, my area especially is American involvement in Vietnam and really post-World War II U.S. history. And there's some pretty dicey stuff that we talk about in terms of post-World War II U.S. history. And I always took some pride in being able to really get good, juicy conversations going, but students never being able to tell where I was in terms of my attitudes toward those issues or how those issues are playing out now. Now, do we, and Mark and Laura should certainly jump in on this, do we make an effort to try to bring speakers to campus who represent a variety of views on issues of the day? Absolutely. harking back to what Laura said a minute ago, quoting Chancellor Kerr, I used to tell at our previous institution, I've said it here, I've said it to parents particularly, if your child is not made uncomfortable intellectually at least some point in her or his experience here, you should ask for your money back. Now, I'm quick to say, Richard, we're not actually going to give it back. But you should call us on that. But as Laura said, I think really well a minute ago, it is about being intellectually challenged, not personally challenged. And so that's, the only ideology that I bring to this position, I believe in two fundamental things: responsibility and opportunity. We have a responsibility for ourselves as individuals. We have a responsibility to our brothers and sisters. We should create and seize opportunities in our own lives, and we have an obligation to help create opportunity in the lives of other people. I think that's an idea that pretty much anybody, no matter which cable network they watch, could get behind. But that's my little sermon. So I'm saying.
I think that there are lots of academic institutions in the world that are left-leaning. I think that's true. I think there are a number that are right-leaning. And I think that the students that gravitate to those places are going to gravitate to those places no matter what. The students that we have here, they are deeply earnest, deeply committed students and people. And Clarence is right. They don't come to us as blank slates. They've attended churches just like we all did. They have parents who have beliefs that they either espouse or they contradict, just like we all did. And when they walk into the classroom and we meet them and we say something, they look at us and go, I don't think so. And then we have a conversation about that. Or they nod their heads and they're in agreement because we've struck a chord with them. I think on any given campus, and I have taught for nearly 30 years on a bunch of different campuses, you are going to find faculty on both sides of the political spectrum who are going to be willing to use the mini pulpit of the classroom. I think it is one of the things that happens with academics. I think that we do it on Monmouth College's campus far less than most other places, frankly. And that most of our professors are, in fact, interested in teaching their subjects and teaching their students and getting their students to engage in complex thinking and difficult debates. And part of what you have to do if you're going to do complex thinking and difficult debates is you have to focus, and you have to focus your students. And anything that begins to pull politically on that generally is going to distract your focus. It means you're not doing a good class. It means your students are not going to learn what they need to learn. And I think our campus has done a pretty good job of, through and through, of engaging tough topics, teaching hard things, and having our students come out the other side, seeing the world with more colors to it than they would have otherwise seen, no matter what those colors are.
The college's student body has ebbed and flowed in size over the years. Just a general question, what's the current administration's visit on the ideal size for a student body at Monmouth College from both a community and a financial perspective? What's the ideal size for Monmouth College, given our current resources and all of that?
Well, let me start, and then I'll have both ends of the table here. It's funny how that worked out. But both ends of the table here do that. One of my duties in my previous life at Center College was Chief Planning Officer, and I did that for a long time. We went through several cycles of strategic planning, and one of the things that I discovered was true. It's both funny and true that you ask any alumnus of an institution that question: what's the ideal size of the college? Is whatever it was their senior year. I had a friend who worked, a guy who was a retired executive who worked at the college, graduated in 1946. He thought the ideal size was 450. He knew better. Others, it was about 750, be 800 when Lovie and I were in school, et cetera, et cetera. There are a variety of factors that go into that calculation. One of them, certainly the most important, is the external environment. We are at the peak of the baby boom. The latest peak in the number of traditional college age students, 18 to 22, peaked in 2013, and has been going since. And of course, in Illinois, it's been like ba 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 ba. In 2025, it's going to be Wile E. Coyote going off the cliff. So that fact alone defines size. There are a variety of factors that we consider when we are looking to recruit the optimum class, not just the optimum size class, but the optimum class. We have a commitment to racial and ethnic diversity. Fortunately, it's fortunate that that commitment is there, because that is the growth that is taking place in the traditional college age population is primarily from first generation college students and from underrepresented populations. It is this year or next year that age group, 18 to 24, will be the demographer's term is a majority minority. So there's that reality that you have to acknowledge, the fact that there are just fewer of them out there. Finance, revenue is an important part of it. We are an extraordinarily generous institution, but we have to be able to generate the financial resources that are going to ensure the quality of this experience. If you step into my office sometime this weekend, I hope I'll be with you if you do that, but I have a blackboard in my office, being the former history teacher that I am, and the word that never gets erased off of that board and is written in the biggest letters is quality. The institutions that are committed to quality and continue to improve their quality are the ones that are going to succeed, and the ones that sacrifice that aren't. We have to be able to generate the resources that are going to allow us to invest in quality programs, quality faculty and staff, and to be able to support bright and observing students who can come and succeed in a rigorous experience like Monmouth College. Another part of the course is to, the question about international students and recruiting internationally. We have made a concerted effort to go outside of Illinois. When Lovie and I arrived, 9% of our student body was from outside the state. We had an admissions counselor, I kid you not, we had one admissions counselor whose territory was the 47 contiguous states other than Illinois. And she traveled all of those 4 times. But we've turned that around, and now in this class, of course, is still shaping up, but the rising sophomore, the freshman class from this past year, was 28% out of state. So and then there's the preparation of you need to recruit students who are going to retain, succeed. We have focused a great deal on retention and really seen some great progress in terms of student success. It's sort of a rambling answer to your question, is that there's so many factors that go into this. It really is kind of like a kaleidoscope or a Rubik's Cube, whichever analogy you want to take. But when you talk about optimum size, you have to take all of those other factors in place. And really, our strategic plan as a senior administration, as a board, is to build all of those factors for the long run, to be able to create a quality of experience that is compelling to prospective students and who are then attractive to prospective employers and graduate schools, also attractive to faculty and staff as well, and to be able to continue to build that. And a lot of this comes in, a shorthand way of saying this is market presence.
So this was just a good way to lead you into saying something about the endowment.
it as well. So, you know, we're working to build the size of the college in a way that will sustain the college for the long run. Okay, if you ask me now, and we've talked about this again as a senior administration and as a board, really as a campus community too, to get to 11 to 1,200, and to be able to, with all those other factors working correctly, and that, you know, that's, you know, working within, say, a 10-year, you know, 7 to 10 year time frame, to be able to get there and sustain that, but sustain it in a way that serves the college for the long run. That's kind of where we are. Anybody else want to jump in on that?
I'd add only that you can get too small, because we are in a flyover state in a small town, and students will feel it, because you want this sort of dynamic that happens when it's lively, and students can from time to time see someone they don't know as well. And so I think that what the president says about the size is about right for this campus. I mean, it could get bigger, but this isn't the kind of school, it would not be the same place if we were at 5,000 or 6,000, for example. You know, it wouldn't have that same, it would be someplace else, but it wouldn't have that. What we value so much is the relationships with the faculty and the relationships between the students. You start becoming student number 931029021, which I shouldn't have told you, because that's actually my student ID number. But I think that size, it holds that intimacy that allows learning to take place in a way that's transformative, and I think that's what we do so well here.
This is a financial question. I'm, in general, noticing that mounting student debt is becoming such an issue, and it's not really an issue our generation had to grapple with nearly as much. And I'm concerned about how that might affect long-term alumni giving, and I was curious as to whether that is a concern that you also share, and to what extent.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I would say that in comparison with national numbers and national average, Monmouth College graduates are doing a little better in terms of the debt that they're leaving college with. One of the things we often talk with students about, given the cost of college today and fluctuations in need-based aid from the federal government and the state governments, which has risen slightly over time but has not at all kept pace with economic inflation or the cost of college. For many students, if they are interested in the idea of attending a private college, taking on some kind of debt is probably going to be the way that they do that. Now, I can make a strong argument for the value and that some level of responsible borrowing is probably appropriate given what they're getting in return. In the same way that many students and families won't hesitate to sign up for a mortgage or a car loan to finance a significant investment. I kind of think of college as that. We try to do as much as we can on the front end with the students that we're recruiting and through the process of bringing them in as first-year students to provide some financial literacy education, because I think many students who've had trouble with loan debt and many of the students currently in default nationally have repayment options available to them that would probably be doable, but they're not sure what they are, they're not sure how to access them. I think there's, we often talk with students about, there's a big difference between borrowing $20,000 and borrowing a lot more than $20,000, which is difficult to do if you're interested in federal loans because there are some restrictions on that. So I'm not sure about the impact on alumni giving, but I agree that it is of concern and it's something that we talk at length about. As a part of our process, our counselors are trained to, the expectation we set in our office is that the counselors have that conversation with the family. They've reviewed with the family in person, preferably not only their financial aid award, but a cost estimate, and had some discussion about what is your plan to cover this balance. Do you understand the terms and conditions of loans and how that works? And only then do we encourage the students to submit a deposit so that they're coming in kind of with that understanding. It's not helpful to us if they're excited about Monmouth and they sign up and then they get a bill and they're surprised by that, or worse, they get through a semester or a year or 2 years and then they struggle to come up with the money to make up the difference. So I think Monmouth is probably doing a little more than a lot of other places, but financial literacy is key, I think.
I think it's a realistic concern in terms of alumni support.
Yep.
And I think it's caused us to think slightly differently about our strategy, particularly as it relates to young alumni. Up until this concern about student debt and rising student debt has surfaced, the goal was to try and get young alumni engaged and get them giving as soon after graduation as possible at some level, right? And have them give over time consistently, even though it might be a small amount, to build a pattern, if you will, a habit of giving back to the institution. The realization now is we might not see those small gifts occur until 5 years out, 8 years out, while they're paying down student debt. And so during that 5-8 year period where they're paying down debt, we still want to remain connected with them and have them feel as though they're part of the Monmouth community, even though they're not on campus anymore. And so I think it's caused us to think differently about that strategy of engaging them after graduation until they're at a point in their careers that they're able to start creating that habit of giving. Do you want to add to that in any way?
We're doing, a little bit now, just working with the students while they're students and creating that culture of philanthropy in their mindset and trying to illustrate to the students how many of you all are giving back to the college, which is making their education possible, putting names and faces to the support they're getting. And I think that really starts, to resonate with them. And we are seeing our student participation numbers climb, and we're trying to work that continuing program that as they become alums, that we're going to see those numbers jump as well. Our average 10-year out window of alums giving is pretty much in line with the typical participation rate we see with other colleges like us. But we want to do better. We want to try to engage them sooner and get that loyalty and tradition to continue so we can remain this place we are, this amazing place.
Richard, you want to say something? Did you want to say something?
Well, in order to add to that, I can simply say that with respect to the average debt of the average Monmouth graduate is below the national average. And if you look, for example, pay scale every year comes out with an assessment of the return on the investment with respect to the average jobs 10 and 20 years out of your graduates versus the cost of their education, adding in financial aid. Monmouth has always done very well in that regard. Additionally, of course, we try to keep debt low by virtue of our financial aid program. We award a lot of institutional aid, both funded and unfunded, and then pricing. For example, we're the only member of the ACM whose total student charges is under $50,000. So we consciously work to try to also not price ourselves out of the market or force our students to incur more debt than they might be able to handle.
And this is where I'll talk about the campaign.
Yeah.
Richard mentioned funded and unfunded debt. That's sort of an inside baseball way of not debt, but institutional financial aid. What that refers to, funded aid, is the financial aid that is supported by an endowment dedicated to student financial aid and scholarships. We have an exceptionally generous program of institutional student financial aid scholarships. Only 6.9% of that commitment is funded by endowment. That needs to be substantially bigger for any number of reasons. The two most prominent being, number one, that it allows us to be a place of even greater opportunity for students from across the board. It will enable us to help take some more of the pressure off of that portion of it that they will self-fund through work or student loan. In principle, I like the idea of a student having a little bit of skin in the game, a little bit. The other part of it is that gifts to endowment for student financial aid and scholarships are really gifts that give twice, because every dollar that we spend on financial aid and scholarships that is funded by endowment rather than being funded from operating revenue is a dollar that we can invest in the quality of other aspects of the institution.
Okay, well, in order for us to all stay on task for the day, I think we're gonna have to wrap up.